Well, good morning. Last time I was here, I think about a year or two ago, I was talking about how my ethnic background is Assyrian, which, if you're familiar with Old Testament history, you'll recall the Assyrians are talked a lot about in the Old Testament, which sounds pretty cool. Until you realize we are the sworn enemies of Israel, so consequently, that makes us the sworn enemies of God. So that was kind of a bummer growing up and finding that out. But we're the ones who God would use as an instrument of judgment against the enemies of Israel, against Israel. I should take that back. So yeah, it was kind of a difficult thing figuring that out and kind of trying to come to grips with it. But the Assyrians were actually very ruthless people as well. Like, they aren't just known for sort of biblical fame, but also they would attack people in warfare and were just brutal. They would chop off people's heads, throw them against walls. We would gouge out people's eyeballs. We were known to skin people alive. We would take our enemies' dead bodies, put them on spears, light them on fire, and use their burning bodies as light for our parties at night. But we're a lot nicer now. I haven't hurt anybody today, and so I'm on a roll. Be of good cheer. If you have a question afterwards, I won't kill you. Very friendly. We've repented at the preaching of Jonah, no less. So, all right. You might be thinking then, why are we talking about evolution in church? I mean, come on. This isn't really talked about in the Bible. Jesus didn't bring it up. None of the epistles of Paul or James or whatever are about evolution. So why are we bringing this topic up? Well, the answer is simple. Evolution is a false idea that prevents people from accepting the gospel. Evolution is a false idea that prevents people from accepting the gospel. And in fact, it was the great Presbyterian scholar J. Gresham Machen who said about 100 years ago today, he said, false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the gospel. He says, we might preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. You see, he realized, and this is true, that if you let the culture around you believe ideas that make them think Christians and Christianity is just a harmless delusion, this will make it harder for them to accept the gospel. And that's why we care about this subject. Yeah, it's not something that Jesus talked about, but if it prevents people from accepting the gospel, we got to understand it and know how to deal with it. So you might ask, well, what is it about evolution, if somebody believes in it, that might cause them to not maybe accept the gospel? And I want you to consider some of the implications of believing in evolution. Now, keep in mind, when I use the word evolution here, what I'm talking about is naturalistic evolution. I know there are some Christians who say, well, I'm a Christian and I believe in God, but I think evolution is the way we got here. That's not what I'm talking about here today. I'm not going to discuss the merits or pros and cons of that view. My point here is to talk about naturalistic evolution, which is not God-guided at all. This is the way Charles Darwin understood evolution. This is how neo-Darwinists today understand evolution. It has nothing to do with God. It's the absence of God. It's a way to explain how life got here without appealing to God. So I'm saying, if you believe, or if someone comes to believe in that type of evolution, what logically follows? Well, I'll tell you a few things. Number one is this. It would turn out that we have no value as human beings. The reason why we do have value as human beings, that we believe as Christians, is because God teaches in Genesis that he made human beings in his image. And it's in virtue of being made in God's image that gives us our value. But if there is no God and evolution is the way we got here, we're not made in his image, therefore we're not valuable. Douglas Futuyma, who is a well-known evolutionist, he's written textbooks on evolution, says this: some shrink from the conclusion that the human species was not designed, has no purpose, and is the product of mere mechanical mechanisms. But this seems to be the message of evolution, right? So he makes the same point. The same process, if evolution's true, the same process that led to the emergence of humans also led to the emergence of a swarm of mosquitoes or a herd of cows, okay? And so if it's just a blind chance random process, then what makes us valuable any more than any other animal out there? A second implication of evolution, if it's true, is that we have no soul. We have no immaterial part of who we are. Because think about it, evolution is a physical process working on physical parts, which can only result in a physical thing. That is a human being that is purely physical. And so therefore, there's no possibility, there's no way that evolution can create a non-material, non-physical entity like a soul. Paul Churchland, who is a well-known philosopher, in his book Matter and Consciousness, writes this. He says, the important point about the evolutionary story is that the human species and all of its features are the physical outcome of a purely physical process. If this is correct account of our origins, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our account of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, and we should learn to live with that fact. So again, if evolution is true, we have no soul, and if we have no soul, there probably is not any kind of an afterlife, because there's no you to survive the death of your body. Well, what else follows logically from evolution? Well, it turned out that we have no possibility of free will. Because think about it. If we're just a physical object, physical objects don't have the capacity to engage in free will acts. Think of a billiard ball. A billiard ball is purely physical, and it can't just change directions on its own freely. It only moves based on what's bumped into it and other factors of physics. Take a stapler, which is more complicated than a billiard ball. A stapler can't, on its own, freely decide to start stapling, because it's purely a physical object. It has no capacity for free will. Take something more complicated than a stapler. How about an automobile? It too, although it seems to do things on its own, doesn't have the capacity for free will because it's purely a physical object. The same with the computer and the same with a human being. If it's the case that we're purely physical objects, we have no capacity to engage in any kind of a free will. We are simply determined to think and act in every way that we think and act. And by the way, every evolutionist who understands evolution believes this is the case. Listen to what William Provine says. Biology leads to a wholly mechanistic view of life, as Darwin suspected. Free will, as usually conceived, does not exist. Okay. Now, if evolution is true, also there's no ultimate standard of morality, right? If there is no God who made us, and we are just the products of a blind, random, and chance process, then there is also no God out there to create a standard of behavior, a perfect standard of behavior by which we must judge and base our behaviors from. There's no standard of morality out there. So there's no standard of morality out there, then we just kind of behave how we want to behave, okay? You just do whatever you want to do. What's right and wrong is up to you. Michael Roos, who writes in his book, The Darwinian Paradigm, says this about ethics. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about some sort of objective something, ethics, he says, is illusory. It's an illusion. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. It's an illusion. And so again, if there's no ultimate standard of morality, we decide what is right and wrong. That's called relativism. And let me just give you an example of extreme form of relativism. How many here have ever remember or have heard of Jeffrey Dahmer? Raise your hand. Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer back in the 80s or so. He murdered, dismembered, and in some cases ate his victims, about 17 men and children. And listen to what he said in an interview on Dateline's NBC. He said, look, if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyways. I always believed the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. And when we died, that was it. There is nothing. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you believe in evolution, that you're going to become like Jeffrey Dahmer, okay? That's not my point. My point, however, is if evolution is true, there is no standard of morality, and ultimately we're free to do whatever we want. Morality is relative to us, or it's relative to our culture or society, and that means anything ultimately can go. Furthermore, if evolution is true, there's ultimately no ultimate meaning in life as well. If evolution is true, there is no God. Then think about it. When we die, we just die. We enter into the earth, and that's it. We have no future consciousness because we have no soul. Eventually, all the human race will die. Eventually, the universe will collapse upon itself. There will be a thermal heat death, and nothing will exist. And nothing will matter at that point. All the greatness and genius of human creation, art and poetry and song, all that will just be extinguished forever in eternity. Because nothing will ultimately mean anything. In fact, I like what William Provine, how he sums up the implications of evolution. Here he's kind of summarizing it. He says this: let me summarize my views on what the modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. He says, these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There's no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end of me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either. Boy, what a spirit lifter this guy is. Wow, you know. Just want to invite him to your next party and, just liven things up. Jeez. Yeah, but that's basically the point. That's the message of evolution, and that's why I say if evolution is true and people end up believing it, this is what they have a tendency to want to believe, because this is the logical outworking of this belief system. And people are buying into it. In fact, Jerry Coyne of the University of Chicago, who's a well-known evolutionist, vicious opponent against any form of religion, says this: look, evolution, he says, it's a fact. Okay, it's a fact. Far from casting doubt on Darwinism, the evidence gathered by scientists over the past century and a half support it completely. And even the most famous atheist on the planet, Richard Dawkins, okay, again, also a very vocal critic of Christianity and any religion and a massive proponent of evolution, says the same thing. Evolution's a fact, okay? Again, almost repeating the same thing that Jerry says. He says, evolution's a fact beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt. Beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. And then he goes on to say, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. So, if you're here this morning and you deny evolution, which one of those are you? Are you ignorant? Are you insane? Are you stupid? Are you wicked? Fill out the form, check all that apply, give them to Pastor Reg, and he'll contact you and pray for you afterwards, okay? But that seems like what the options are for us according to Richard Dawkins. So look, I understand evolution is a complex subject, and I can understand that this subject can become very quickly very, very technical. So I realize this is a sermon. This isn't an upper division biology class at Harvard University. So my intention is to present a very modest goal, okay? And my goal here is to simply teach you just one thing. This morning, I just want to teach you one thing, and that is a tactic, okay? And this tactic will help you to understand what to do when you run across the topic of evolution, either on TV, or you're having a conversation with somebody, or you're reading about it in a magazine or a textbook. This tactic will help you to understand, okay, what do I do next? And this tactic is based on something called the Columbo tactic, which is a tactic that at Stand to Reason, where I work, we teach a lot about this. How many have ever seen the TV show Columbo? Raise your hand. Looks like a lot of you have. That's all. Wait a minute. How many have never seen the TV show Columbo? That's a lot of non-Christians here. That's horrible. Okay, I'm going to pray for you guys. Father in heaven, we pray for these lost souls. Okay. No, so Columbo is a great show. If you ever had a chance to see a rerun, get it. Just definitely watch it. But basically, Lieutenant Columbo is a detective, and he uses questions routinely in every episode in order to figure out who the killer or the guilty person is in any kind of crime. And so we talk about this using questions and how important it is. And here's the key question to ask on the topic of evolution. Here's the one tactic that I want you to learn and take away from this sermon this morning, and that is this. Whenever you come across evolution, just ask this question. What do you mean by evolution? That's it. What do you mean by evolution? In other words, I want you to ask, what definition of evolution are you using, or is the person using, or is the article author using? And that's because there's at least 3 different definitions of evolution. I'm going to define for you those 3 definitions, and then I'm going to tell you why this simple, basic, and easy tactic is so important whenever you come across evolution. So here's the first definition. This is definition number 1 for the word evolution. Sometimes when evolutionists refer to evolution, here's what they mean. Change over time. Change over time. Now think about it. If all evolution means is change over time, then doesn't everything evolve, right? Cities evolve, clouds evolve, my children's bedroom evolves, your children's grades evolve, hopefully up and not down, right? I mean, everything evolves. Even the definition of evolution evolves. If evolution simply means change over time, then, man, any one of us here can agree that evolution is a fact, right? If that's all one means is change over time. And so I would agree with Richard Dawkins. Evolution is a fact if what you mean by evolution is change over time. Now, there is a second definition of evolution that is often used by evolutionists, and it's one that was proposed by Charles Darwin in the first 5 chapters of his book on the origin of species. And this definition is called the special theory of evolution, or modern scientists refer to it as microevolution. Right, microevolution. And you know, this is based on Charles Darwin's findings that when he looked at different species, he noticed that their morphology was not fixed. In other words, their form and function of different species changed over time. Species seem to adapt to their environment, okay? And this is something that is observable and it's empirical. In fact, something that any one of us, even within our lifetimes, could observe. Let me give you some examples of microevolution, where a species changes over time. The most popular example is called natural selection. In fact, this phrase is often associated with the term evolution, okay? And natural selection simply says this. Imagine you have a population of giraffes, some with long necks, some with shorter necks, and the only available food source is high up on those trees. So tell me, which giraffes are going to be able to access the food source? The ones with the long necks or the one with the short necks? The one with the long necks, obviously. And what's going to happen to the giraffes with the short necks? What's the tendency of what's going to happen to them? Yeah, they're going to die, okay? And guess what? Dead giraffes rarely ever mate. Well, actually, they never mate, right? And so since the giraffes with shorter necks will not mate, that means the giraffes that do mate will have longer necks, and it's those genetics, those genes with longer necks, which will be passed on to the next generation, and then you'll have an increasing number of giraffes with longer necks, because those are the only ones that survive. That is natural selection. Notice, nature is selecting for a characteristic, long necks, and making it pass on to the next generation. That's all natural selection is. So notice there's nothing controversial about that. There's nothing unchristian about that. There's nothing anti-biblical about that. It's just, that's what happens in nature. No problem. Here's another example. Finch beak variation. Charles Darwin and even modern researchers have noticed that finches, these birds, have different sizes of beaks. Okay? Some large beaks, some small beaks. And what they noticed on the Galapagos Islands is that whenever there was a drought, it's turned out that only large nuts were available as a food source for these birds. The smaller nuts tended to disappear during a drought. So guess which finches were able to crack the larger nuts? The one with the larger beaks or the one with the smaller beaks? The one with the larger beaks, obviously, because they had the power to crush the nut and get at the food source. So what happened after many years is that the finches with smaller beaks, their population decreased, and the finches with larger beaks increased. Okay? That change in the population is called an evolutionary change, which again is just simply an example of microevolution. Is that a big deal? Is that controversial? No. Can we as Christians accept that understanding? Absolutely. Here's another example. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria. How many of you have ever had to take antibiotics because they got sick? Raise your hand if that's ever. Okay. What's the one rule your doctor asks you to follow when you take antibiotics? Yeah, take the whole course, right? And the reason is because if you take antibiotics to make you feel better and then you stop, some of the bacteria that's making you sick might still be alive in your body. And then what happens is that bacteria adapts to the antibiotics. It develops a resistance to it. It starts to grow back and make you sick again. And then when you take the antibiotics, it doesn't work, because the bacteria have developed a resistance to the antibiotics. Evolutionists call that an evolutionary change. Again, that's just simply a microevolutionary change, but still, that's they call it an evolutionary change. Now, again, is that controversial? No. We know that happens, and that's not a threat to our faith as Christians in any way. There's another example called the peppered moth. There are two forms of the peppered moth. There's a dark-colored peppered moth, which you can see there resting on a tree trunk that's very light. And then there's a light-colored peppered moth to the bottom right-hand corner. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a peppered moth that's light right there on the bottom right. It's very well camouflaged. Guess which colored peppered moth gets eaten by birds more often? The dark one, because it stands out like a sore thumb. But here's what many evolutionists recognized. When the Industrial Revolution started to occur in England, the pollution began to darken the tree trunks of those trees, and instead of those tree trunks being light, they turned dark. And now guess what happened? The light-colored peppered moths, you can see on the right, became totally obvious, and the dark-colored ones became completely camouflaged. Now guess which ones the birds ate the most? Obviously, the light-colored one, because they stand out like a sore thumb. So notice the population of light-colored peppered moths was lower, then it increased over time as the pollution increased. Then when there was anti-pollution laws and the tree trunks became light again, the population changed again. Okay? These population differences and changes over time, evolutionists call evolution. Again, that's just an example of microevolution. It's just a population change. Nothing controversial about it. We can all as Christians accept that. Again, no big deal. And of course, even the story of Adam and Eve, right? We believe as Christians, there was these two people, Adam and Eve, that had a certain height, had a certain hair color, had a certain skin color, had a certain bone structure. But now as we look all over the entire planet and we see different races of people, we see some people, for example, in the Middle East, where my family is from, have dark complexion. Some people in Scandinavian countries have light complexion. Some people have dark hair, some people have light hair, some people have big bone structure. There's variation within the human species. And of course, the human species has adapted to different parts of the earth. Again, no big deal. This is just a microevolutionary change. All of us recognize this happens and can accept it. So notice, evolution is a fact if by evolution you mean the special theory of evolution or microevolution. Okay? So notice these first two definitions of evolution are completely uncontroversial, and we as Christians can subscribe to them. And I would agree with Richard Dawkins. Yes, evolution is a fact if that's what you mean by evolution. But there's a third definition of evolution that I want you to become aware of. Oh, and by the way, this second definition of evolution, microevolution, where species can adapt to their environment to survive, I would actually argue this is a design feature that God has programmed into the DNA of all species to allow them to adapt and survive at different places around the world, different environments, different circumstances. So again, no big deal. But there's a third definition of evolution that we need to be aware of. And this definition is called the general theory of evolution, or modern scientists refer to it as macroevolution. And at its core, macroevolution is simply an extrapolation of microevolution. In other words, evolutionists will argue that basically if you take microevolution, these small changes, and you let these changes occur for millions of years, this will eventually lead to giant macroevolutionary changes. Now, this definition of evolution is not observable. It's theoretical because you need millions of years in order to observe it to happen, if it even happens at all. Now, this macroevolution is intended to explain all of the diversity of the species on the earth. Okay? For example, macroevolution allegedly explains how reptiles eventually evolved into birds, or how amphibians eventually evolved into reptiles, or how some sort of land-dwelling mammal, like a dog-like animal, eventually evolved into orcas and whales and dolphins, or how an ape-like creature eventually evolved into human beings. So notice what's different about macroevolution. This claims that species can literally transform into some completely different species. And evolutionists believe that the mechanism that how that's happening is the microevolutionary changes leading to that. Okay? And so if you then say, well, is evolution a fact? If by evolution you mean macroevolution, then I think the answer is no. It's not a fact. It's a hypothesis, it's a theory, but it's not a fact. Okay? So notice these three different definitions of evolution: change over time, microevolution, and macroevolution. Okay? Those are the three definitions. And notice why it's a key question to ask. What do you mean by evolution? And you want to know what version of evolution is being referred to, or you're talking to somebody about it, whether they're referring to 1, 2, or 3. Because if it's 1 or 2, you can say, yeah, I agree, it is a fact. If they're referring to number 3, then you say, well, I'm not sure about that. I might disagree with it. Okay? So now that you understand these three different definitions, let me explain to you why this tactic is so important. Because here's what's happening. There are two problems with these three definitions of evolution. The first problem, as I'm going to describe in a moment, is called the fallacy of equivocation. And the second problem with these definitions is that microevolution is not actually evidence for macroevolution. So let's take each one of these points in turn. First, let me talk about the fallacy of equivocation. This is a mistake in thinking. It's a mistake in logic. When someone equivocates on the meaning of one word in an argument or in a discussion. All right? Let me give you an example of this from the Jehovah's Witnesses, because sometimes the Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door and they do not believe in the Trinity. They don't believe in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit as being part of one God who exists as three persons. So here's the way they try to argue against my view as a Trinitarian. They say this: you Christians, you evangelicals, believe that Jesus is God, don't you? I say, yes. They say, well, you also say that God is triune. Isn't that not true? I say, yeah, it's true. They say, well, if Jesus is God and God is triune, then therefore Jesus is triune. Now, tell me, is Jesus triune? Okay. Yeah, we're in church. The answer should be no, okay? Jesus is not triune. God is triune. He's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But Jesus is just one of those persons. Jesus is not triune himself. So notice, the conclusion that Jesus is triune is a false conclusion. And I want you to look at that slide again and tell me, how did they get to that false conclusion? What word on this slide is being used with two different definitions? Can anyone tell me? Okay, it's God. That's right. The word God is being used with two different definitions. So you're right, the word is related to it because God is. But here's what's going on. When we say Jesus is God, what we mean by God is we mean divine. When we say God is triune, what we mean by God is Yahweh. Okay? So notice the word God is being used with two different meanings, but it's not obvious, it's not explicit which meaning is being used at which time, and that's what allows to create a false conclusion that Jesus is triune. So that's why that argument does not make sense. It's not logical, it's not valid, it's a fallacy, it's an error in thinking. The same is true when evolutionists talk about evolution. They equivocate on the definition of the word evolution. Remember, there's three different definitions, and they'll just use the word evolution every single time, but in some cases they mean micro, some cases they mean macro, and sometimes they just mean change over time. But they don't make that explicit, and that's what leads to the false conclusion. So, for example, they'll say, evolution is a fact, okay? And they'll show you a picture of finch beaks, so they'll tell you about finch beaks. So, see, is not evolution a fact? You say, well, yeah, you're right, I agree with that. Now, in your mind, you're thinking that's microevolution. They'll say, therefore, evolution, meaning macroevolution, is also a fact, is also true. So do you see the first word evolution, they mean micro, and the second definition of evolution, they're referring to macroevolution. So notice they're equivocating on the word evolution, although they don't use those different words, micro and macro. They don't use the definition. They'll say evolution's a fact, right? Don't you believe that bacteria can develop a resistance against antibiotics? You're like, yeah, of course they do. Yeah, of course it's a fact. Well, then therefore evolution's true. Therefore, an ape can turn into a human. Well, wait a minute. How does that work? That doesn't seem to make sense. That's right, because the reason is the first time they mean micro, the second time they mean macro. They say evolution's a fact. Don't you see the peppered moth? You have light-colored, dark-colored. Their populations increase and decrease and oscillate like this. Isn't that a fact? Yes. Therefore, reptiles can turn into birds. It's like, what? Wait a minute. No, in the first case, evolution, they're referring to micro. In the second case, they're referring to macro. Okay? They're guilty of the fallacy of equivocation. Now, I'm not saying they're doing this on purpose. They might be, but usually most people don't do this on purpose. They're just not being careful with the definition of their terms. Right? The National Academy of Sciences, which is the most powerful science organization in the United States, they have a guidebook for teachers and educators around the country. It's called Teaching About Evolution and the Nature of Science. I have this booklet. This is a picture of it. And I want you to see how in the booklet they often explain all the evidence for evolution. But the vast majority of evidences that they provide are examples of change over time and microevolution. And since we all acknowledge that those are true examples, we think, oh, well, I guess evolution is true. The whole story must be true as well. So let me test your knowledge. Let's just see how well you guys were paying attention, okay? So I'm going to show you a couple of quotes from this book, and I want you to tell me, by shouting out confidently and clearly, whether it's definition number 1, 2, or 3, whether it's change over time, microevolution, or macroevolution, okay? So here's the first one. This is page 11 on the booklet. It says this: the world around us changes. This simple fact is obvious everywhere we look. Mammals now live in a world that was once dominated by reptilian giants such as Tyrannosaurus rex. Okay, is that an example of change over time, micro or macroevolution? Yeah, I heard most people say change over time, and that's true. Okay, all they're saying is that things change. Like, yeah, duh. Who disagrees with that? That the world has changed? Of course it has. Okay, here's an example. No one saw the evolution of a one-toed horse from a three-toed horse, but that does not mean that we cannot be confident that horses evolved. When they say horses evolved, what definition of evolution are they talking about? Change over time, micro or macro? Micro, exactly, right? That there was a horse that had 3 toes, then it had 1 toe, okay, yeah, so it adapted to its environment, big deal. Okay. Here's an example. Evolution, in the broadest sense, explains that what we see today is different from what existed in the past. Galaxies, stars in the solar system, and Earth have changed through time, hint, 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 and so is life on Earth. So is this change over time, micro or macro? Change over time. Yeah, it's like, duh, like the solar system has changed. Of course. Well, that's all you mean by evolution. Like, how is that controversial? Here's another one. The North American lacewing species, which is an insect, separated from a common ancestor species recently in evolutionary time, and they're very similar. But these two have different colors reflecting their different habitats, and they breed at different times of the year. Is that change over time, micro or macro? Micro, that's right. It's just a species. Now there's 2 of them with different colors. Some breed at some times of the year, others breed the other times. Okay, no big deal. Or how about this one? Was kind of skip down to the middle of the paragraph. Many strains of bacteria have become increasingly resistant to once effective antibiotics as natural selection has amplified resistant strains that arose through naturally occurring genetic variations. Okay? Change over time, micro or macro? Micro. It's like, yeah, of course we see antibiotics becoming less effective. So notice, throughout the entire book, they give all kinds of examples of change over time and microevolution, which all of us would be like, of course, these are real things. No one denies them. But what they are implying is, therefore, macroevolution is true. But they never make this distinction explicitly. They just want you to make that conclusion. And this, of course, leads us to the second problem I mentioned, and that is that microevolution is not evidence for macroevolution. Yes, microevolution has the capacity to help species adapt to their environments, but it can't turn them into something completely different. Take selective dog breeding, which is an intelligently designed enterprise where we try to breed dogs in a way to create Great Danes and little Chihuahuas, okay? We can make all sorts of variations with dogs, but notice, they're still dogs. We can't make them turn into a giraffe, right? And that's because the ability for their DNA to adapt is limited. It can only go so far. It can't make a dog into something completely different. The same thing with finch beak variation. Yes, large-beaked finches and small-beaked finches might vary from time to time. Their populations might increase and decrease. And it's interesting, the article about these finches is called Oscillating Selection on Darwin's Finches. This is the paper that was presented in the Nature article. Nature is a pro-evolutionary journal. But they typically, in kind of college or high school textbooks, they never put the title Oscillating Selection in Darwin's Finches. And here's why, probably. Any careful thinker would realize, wait a minute, oscillating? That means finches with large beaks, although they increased over time and they changed, guess what oscillating means? They eventually changed back. And that's actually what happened. On the Galapagos Islands, when there was a drought, only large seeds were available, large nuts were available. And that made the finches with large beaks plentiful. But when the rains came back and smaller nuts were available, then the population of finches with small beaks increased again. So there was a change in the populations of birds with small and large beaks. Okay, we acknowledge that happens, but how does that change in populations explain how you get beaks in the first place? How can a population variance and fluctuation explain how you get birds in the first place? You can't, because microevolution doesn't prove macroevolution. Even James Tour, who is a synthetic organic chemist at Rice University, just over in Houston, this guy's authored over 630 scientific publications. His name is on 120 patents. He's one of the 10 most cited chemists on the entire planet. And when he speaks on the question of microevolution proving macroevolution, here's what he says. I simply do not understand chemically how macroevolution could have happened. I will tell you as a scientist and as a synthetic chemist, if anybody should be able to understand evolution, it's me. Why? Because this guy makes molecules for a living. He knows how hard it is. And he's saying, look, it doesn't make any sense how it's possible to create entire things like this from a chemistry standpoint. Lynn Margulis, who's a eminent biologist, PhD in botany from UC Berkeley. She was married to Carl Sagan for a time. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Okay, so this is, again, die-hard evolutionist. She says this, natural selection, which again, this is microevolution, eliminates and maybe maintains, but it doesn't create. Neo-Darwinists say that new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of random mutations leads to evolutionary, meaning macroevolutionary changes. I believed this until I looked for evidence. Whoa. Meaning there's no evidence that microevolution can create macroevolution. Macroevolution changes. And that's why many evolutionists all over the world have started a new organization called the Third Way of Evolution. This is started back in May 2014. It's composed of evolutionists from Oxford, University of Chicago, MIT, UCLA, Princeton, and many other prestigious universities around the world. And they are all composed of evolutionists. These aren't Christians. They don't believe in intelligent design. They vigorously reject intelligent design. But they are all saying, you know what? This idea that these little microevolutionary changes can result in a macroevolutionary change, this is bogus. It doesn't follow the evidence. Here's what they write on their homepage. Neo-Darwinism ignores much of the contemporary molecular evidence. It invokes a set of unsupported assumptions. It has elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems. This is inconsistent with significant bodies of empirical evidence. Wow, that's amazing. They're acknowledging what we've just said. Microevolution does not prove macroevolution is true. And so why am I not an evolutionist? Well, the answer is, actually, I am an evolutionist, if by what you mean by evolution is change over time and microevolution, right? But I'm not an evolutionist if what you mean by evolution is macroevolution. And that's why this key tactic of asking, what do you mean by evolution, is so critical. You want to ask that because if what they mean is change over time or microevolution, then you can say, yeah, I agree with you. I agree. Evolution's a fact, if that's what you mean. But if they're referring to an example of macroevolution, then you say, well, I don't agree with that. And so notice you can be careful and nuanced on this discussion by just a simple question. What do you mean by evolution? You don't want to come across as simply denying all evolution, which makes you look ignorant and foolish. Because in reality, some things do change over time, and even the human race has kind of adapted. No big deal, but we're still humans and we always will be humans. So I haven't argued for what then has created humankind. Of course, I would argue that we all know that God has made us, that there is a God who's made us, who's designed us, and who loved us, and that we're not here by chance. The purpose of this morning was to kind of argue and try to break down a paradigm, which is the evolutionary paradigm. And as has been mentioned, my colleague next week, Timothy Barnett, is going to come and talk about the heavens declared glory and give a positive case for why we know God exists. But notice, if there is a God who made us, who designed us, who loves us, then all of those vacuous implications of evolution that I mentioned at the beginning get turned around completely. Right? There is a God who made us, so therefore he made us in his image, and we are valuable. That's the case. We are more valuable than animals. We do have a soul. We will survive the death of our bodies. There is an afterlife. We do have free will. There is a standard of morality by which we are accountable to. And of course, we have ultimate meaning to know and to serve God. And that's why the psalmist in 139, verses 13 through 14 says this, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." We know that we are not products of a blind and mechanical chance process. We are lovingly and specially designed by God. We are the pinnacle of God's creation. And so now let's go out this week and live in a way that reflects that truth. Let me close in prayer. Father, we thank you for the chance to be able to get together as a body of believers and to be able to talk about subjects like evolution, which so rarely are discussed here in church. And it helps us to understand just the emptiness of this idea that tries to abandon the obvious evidence of your hand in creation, as you talk about in Romans. Lord, we are without excuse, though, because it is so obvious that you have made us and designed us and loved us. And we thank you for that truth, revealed in Scripture and also revealed in creation. May we now turn around and use that knowledge, use that truth to share it with others so that we can ultimately bring honor and glory to your Son's name. Amen. Thank you.